Hello, I'm Steve Sokol, the president of the American Council on Germany, and I'd like to welcome you all to today's conversation. It's always wonderful when we have alumni from our programs speak before our members and friends, and so today I'm especially pleased to welcome two of our Young Leader alumni for a very special book talk about art that was stolen from European Jews in the 1930s and 1940s, and one of the key art experts who helped the Nazis procure that art. Over the summer, historian and Holocaust researcher Jonathan Petropulos published his most recent book titled Göring's Man in Paris, the story of a Nazi art plunderer and his world. It tells the story of a man named Bruno Loza, a person who Jonathan actually had the opportunity to meet. Jonathan is an expert on the subject of Nazi art and restitution and began his research in this field in the early 1980s while a student at Harvard University under the late Richard Hunt, who served as vice chair of the American Council on Germany. Jonathan has written extensively on the subject and has provided expert testimony before the UK House of Commons and the US House of Representatives. He has also served as an expert witness in a number of cases where Holocaust victims have tried to recover lost artwork. Jonathan teaches European history at Claremont McKenna College, where he serves as the John B. Crowell Professor of European History and chairs the History Department. Jonathan, thanks so much for being with us today.
Oh, thank you, Steve, and thank you, Ron Granieri, for being here as well. Ron is one of my former students. We go back many, many years, and it's great to talk to the ACG family. And Steve, I'm so glad that you mentioned my mentor, Richard Hunt. There's not a day that goes by I don't think about him, and I know I would not have had the career I have without him. And this book is a very personal one for me. I sometimes talk about the personal turn. I've written myself into the story, especially towards the end of the book when I got to meet Bruno Loza. And Rick was one person who introduced me to so many key figures in this world. Many of the monuments men were Harvard men and friends of Rick. And I remember being able to go to the faculty club and meet some of the key players in this story too. So, Rick sort of encouraged me to go out and meet the players and such, and that's reflected in this book. So just take a moment to think of him, and he did so much for the ACG as well. So I've been working on this book really for over
Jonathan,
20.
Before you dive in, let me just give our viewers a little bit of a sense of what to expect. Jonathan is going to give a presentation of some of the key points in his book, and then Ron Granieri will lead a discussion with Jonathan. Ron is Associate Professor of History at the Department of National Security at the U.S. Army War College and also serves as Templeton Education Fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. You can see more information about both Jonathan and Ron in the chat. And once again, if you want to pose a question during today's event, you can use the Q&A function. So with that, let me say goodbye for now. But Jonathan, we are really looking forward to your presentation. And Jonathan and Ron, we're looking forward to the discussion afterwards.
Thank you, Steve.
Thanks, Steve.
So yeah, I will speak for about 15 minutes, provide an overview of this book, and then Ron and I will have a conversation and welcome your questions. And so as I was saying, this is a very personal book, and I've been working on it really since 1998, because that's when I met this individual, Dr. Bruno Loza, who had been, as you might imagine from the title of the book, Göring's art agent in Paris during the war and a key art plunderer. And as soon as I met him in 1998, I knew there was a book. And so I went back to interview him approximately 30 times over a 9-year period when he passed away in 2007. And so, getting to know one's subject, it adds a whole dimension to this work of scholarship. Bruno Loza had been a member of the SS, as you see on the left, and it's quite a career, both during the war and after the war. And the book has two sides to it, really. The first is a very intimate, detailed portrait of a Nazi art plunderer, what he did during the war. And then the second part is what happened to him and his cohort after the war as they revived their careers. This is my fourth book that deals with Nazi art looting and restitution. My first book on the left, Art as Politics in the Third Reich, focused on the Nazi leaders. Back in the 1980s, scholars were really looking more at top rank leaders. And it was a project maybe of the 1990s that came to the fore to look at second rank figures. And that's what I did in my subsequent book, The Faustian Bargain. I looked at art experts who collaborated with the Nazi leaders and implemented these plundering programs. And then the third book, Artists Under Hitler, as you can see, is about the creators of culture, the creators of art, and not just visual artists, but musicians and filmmakers and architects, and how they navigated the challenges of Nazi Germany. The book that really led to Göring's Man in Paris, though, is The Faustian Bargain, about these second-rank figures. It was in the 1990s we could finally get access to the papers of these second-rank figures. As many of you know, there's a 30-year law in Germany, and for people who are not of world historical importance, you have to wait till 30 years after their death. And so just to give you an example of someone I tracked for Faustian Bargain, Cajetan Mühlmann on the right there is the most prolific art plunderer of all time. He surpassed Baron Denon, who worked for Napoleon, and any other Nazi art plunderer. He plundered in Vienna after the Anschluss, then in Poland in 1939, and finally in the Netherlands under Seyss-Inquart. And I researched him thoroughly, but what I ended up with was really, this is a metaphor with what I ended up with. This is from his SS file, and it's a partial picture, right? We can get a sense of what Mühlmann looked like and what he did, but there are tremendous gaps in our understanding. There are pieces of the puzzle that are missing. And in Faustian Bargain, I didn't have one chapter longer than 30 pages. I just didn't know more about these individuals, right? I couldn't, there wasn't the depth of material to really understand their lives, but it was different with Loza. But the methodology for trying to understand Mühlmann was important for Loza. It was the pre-internet days, and in order to figure out what had happened to old Nazis, I spent a lot of time in cemeteries, and my friends Tim Ryback and Marie-Louise Ryback, ACG members, they would help me and go look at the cemeteries. And it was actually Marie-Louise Ryback who found Cajetan Mühlmann's grave in Salzburg. And I realized when he died, 1958, and I tracked him to his widow, who lived on the Attersee in the Salzkammergut. She wouldn't let me photograph her. She just went in the house when I took this picture, but she let me go up into the attic and pull down photos she had of Cajetan Mühlmann there, including this one. And I really got a sense of what he had done when he was on the run in the 1950s. Well, finding Frau Mühlmann led me to another old Nazi who was Wilhelm Hüttel, who was an SS general, worked side by side with Adolf Eichmann in Budapest in 1944, annihilating Hungarian Jewry, a very dark figure. And I went to see him up in the Austrian Alps on several occasions. And Hüttel was the one who would tell me where others were too, and that led to Bruno Loza, who, as I mentioned, was 1998. So this was a period in the 1990s when the old Nazis were still alive, many of them, and I took advantage of the opportunity and I went and spoke with them. In fact, Tim Ryback had a joke that when I'd come back to visit him in Salzburg, he'd say, "You should have a TV show. Maybe we can call it This Old Nazi." And every week we would go visit a different Nazi. And levity aside, I think it was an important historical undertaking. And my book benefited from having had a chance to interview Loza. So who was Bruno Loza? An art historian who received his PhD in Frankfurt in 1935. He wrote a capable dissertation, but not a really distinguished one. It didn't open the doors to academia for him, so he became an art dealer. He was working out of his father's house in Berlin, selling art in the late 30s, but he was a very minor figure. He had joined the SS, as I mentioned. When I asked Loza, I said, "Why did you join the SS?" He said, "I like to play sports." He was a good athlete. I suggested there were other reasons to join the SS besides playing sports, or other ways to play sports besides joining the SS. I didn't always get straight answers from Loza. In 1939, he was conscripted and he fought in Poland. He was injured there, some shrapnel, and he took 6 months to recover. He was still in the East in early 1941 when he received a telegram from Hermann Göring, who was in Paris, And Göring realized the Paris art market was exploding and he needed agents, he needed people to assist him. And he asked Loza if he would come, or ordered Loza actually to come to Paris, at least temporarily, to assist him. Loza was supposed to go back to the Eastern Front, but he decided to stay in Paris. He developed a rapport with Hermann Göring, and one can see it in this photo. Loza was stationed at the headquarters of the Nazi art plundering agency, the Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, the ERR, which was in the Jeu de Paume. And Göring made 20 visits to the Jeu de Paume to select art for his own collections. He selected about 750 paintings that went into his collection at Carenhall. And Loza was there for 19 of the 20 exhibitions and the selections, if you will. And you can see that Loza and Göring developed a kind of modus vivendi. They had a kind of connection. Loza was very self-confident and brash and sometimes contrarian, and Göring liked that. And when Loza died, I inherited his photographs. I have about 150 of these images that document his time in Paris. And, we see him assisting Göring, looking at pictures and documents. We also get an image of what it was like to be part of the art plundering staff. While others suffered privation, hardship, the ERR staffers had wine and salmon and silver and china. So again, this is an attempt to show, have a nuanced portrait of an art plunderer, including his private life to some extent. He had a number of paramours, if you will. Here he seems to be putting the antenna of the car into this woman's nose, which might be suggestive of his misogynistic and even sadistic tendencies. Here he's with some other women and a colleague, and he's wearing an SS jumper of some sort. And so, this is part of a trope of victors' photos as they document their romantic conquest, if you will. And I talk about it in the book. This was a very interesting photo, and I think very important, actually, because it shows Loza on the right and Göring looking at two pictures by Henri Matisse. Göring did not acquire them. They were too modern for his taste. But the way they're laughing at this modern art is very, very suggestive. That obviously they did not like degenerate art, and they sequestered the degenerate art in the Jeu de Paume facility, the Salle of Martyrs there. This was fair for barter and trade, and also, I think, gave Loza an opportunity to embezzle and to enrich himself. And when Loza died, I'll give something away, in 2007, he had 40 pictures in his collection worth tens of millions of dollars. So what's the source of this great post-war wealth? Well, I think it lies during the war. And there was a lot of corruption in the Jeu de Paume and amongst the art plunderers. And Loza, like Muhlmann, took advantage of that. So again, my goal is to really get a sense of what it was like to be an art plunderer. Loza talked about going into apartments that were still warm, which I imagine you can understand that the Jewish residents had been recently evicted and sent to Drancy and deported to the east to meet their fate. Sometimes one sees an image like this in the Jeu de Paume with empty frames, and I think it's very poignant and captures the extent of the theft of the criminality. Now, part of the drama involves Loza's nemesis in the Jeu de Paume, Rose Valland, a curator who was spying on him. She pretended she did not speak German, but she did, and she documented what Loza and others did. She went on to become a monuments officer, arguably the most important monuments officer of all, and she tracked Loza up until her death in 1980. In fact, she's very well known in France. There's a graphic portrayal of her experiences. It always kind of amuses me to see Loza and Göring rendered in a cartoon form here, but it's a very good book. It's interesting. Another kind of fun fact, and I won't go into detail here, is that Max Beckmann, I think my favorite artist and also Rick Hunt's favorite artist, he did a painting called Dream of Monte Carlo, where he depicted Loza. Loza is seen here as a croupier, along with another art plunderer, Erhard Goeppel, and Goeppel was a friend of Max Beckmann's and learned of Loza. Beckmann learned of Loza through Goeppel, and so they're these croupiers with cards and blood on their hands, and it's a very interesting but typical Beckmann picture with a complicated allegory and iconography. But that is Loza there. So after plundering for 4 years, Loza retreated to Neuschwanstein. This was the main repository for the ERR, 22,000 objects looted from French Jews. This was in early 1945. Paris had been liberated in August 44, and Loza went to take care of the plunder there. It was safeguarded. There were threats to it from some radical SS elements. Loza also saved the card catalog of the ERR that was important, crucial to restitution work after the war, to know where the paintings, the objects had come from. On May the 4th, 1945, Loza was sitting on the wall at this convent, reading a book about Joan of Arc when he was arrested by this individual here, monuments man James Rorimer. Many of you know that Rorimer went on to direct the Metropolitan Museum of Art, first, actually the only Jewish director of the Met. And so he arrested Loza and did the very first interrogation. Subsequently, Loza, like the other art plunderers, was transferred to Alt-Auzay up in the Salzkammergut. There was a salt mine there that had about 10,000 pictures stored there. They also had an interrogation center. They called it House 71, and they had about 15 of these Nazi art plunderers who they interviewed over the summer of 1945. The key figure here, for our purposes, is Tedrousseau, an OSS officer who went on to become a curator at the Met, the deputy director of the Met under Tom Hoving. And Rousseau, who again interviewed Loza regularly, wasn't quite sure what to make of him. He said, if what Loza says checks out, maybe he's not so bad, but we need to interrogate him further. The Americans ended up handing him over to the French, who kept him in a prison in Paris for 4 years. In 1950, they put Loza and the other ERR staffers on trial. It was interesting that Rousseau and the OSS agents helped Loza during the trial, sending him documents and other kinds of support. Loza, astonishingly enough, was acquitted by the French. This was part of Loza's papers as well. He kept it with him his whole life, is proof that he had been exonerated there. There are reasons for that. The French were tired of justice. The myth of the French resistance, everyone was in the resistance had taken hold. Various reasons he was acquitted, and this allowed him to go back into business in the 1950s. He called himself an art historian, but he was really an art dealer. And he moved to this apartment in Munich, Bogenhausen. Many of you know, a beautiful neighborhood. And he lived on the top floor of this apartment. Fairly modest considering his wealth. He could have had a villa on Lake Starnberg or that, but obviously he wanted to fly a little bit below the radar. He was still associated with the ERR, with Göring. One thing that's crucial in my book is to realize Loza was not alone. He was part of a network or a series of networks of old Nazi dealers who revived their careers in the 1950s. Most of them were based in Munich. That was the center of all these networks. And just to give you a couple examples very fleetingly, Walter Andreas Hofer, who you can see actually was the director of Göring's collection, he lived in Munich and was back in business, putting advertisements in art magazines like Die Weltkunst. He lived in this beautiful apartment building on the English Garden. He was in the top floor, and right below him lived the most important dealer of the Third Reich, Karl Haberstock. He had been a Berlin dealer, but of course, Berlin was badly bombed and was surrounded by communists. There wasn't an ideal place to ply the art trade in the post-war period. So Haberstock moved to Munich, and he lived right below Hofer. Haberstock made a great amount of money selling to Hitler and Göring and the other Nazi leaders. And the money he made, he bought art, which he donated to his hometown of Augsburg, to the Schutzler Palais. And Haberstock was treated like a hero, a great patron. And there's still a Karl Haberstock Strasse in Augsburg. So the Augsburgians were not mastering their past, some problematic Vergangenheitsbewältigung. Another member of the network is Maria Almus Dietrich on the right, here with Hitler at the Berghof. She sold more works to Hitler than any other dealer. And she was right there on the Brienner Strasse through the 50s, 60s, even into the late 90s, the Gallery Almus, with Maria Almus Dietrich there. And of course, there's the Görlitz, who many of you have heard about. Hildebrand Görlitz was one of the dealers in the Third Reich, and he amassed a collection of about 1,600 pictures. Görlitz himself died in 1956, but he passed them on to his widow and the son, and they were found subsequently in his apartment, in his Schwabing apartment. But these are all part of the networks, right? The network is based in Bavaria and Munich, but there's a golden quadrangle. The Austria is part of it, and they had problems with mastering their past about Nazi looted art and more than that in the 50s and beyond. Switzerland is part of this system with the culture of banking secrecy and bank vaults. Liechtenstein with its foundations is part of that. But the networks radiate outwards geographically, and they extend to the United States, as I talk about in my book. Tedrousseau kept a relationship with Loza that lasted over 30 years, and there's about 100 documents. Whenever Rousseau went to Germany, to Europe to buy art for the Met, he would contact Loza and ask to see him. Loza knew where a lot of art was and probably did more. Loza was offering art to Tedrousseau, wonderful paintings by Botticelli and Cézanne and Gauguin, but we can't prove that the Met bought from Loza. It should be mentioned, though, that Loza would use intermediaries, cutouts, and so it's possible that he did sell to the Met via another person. It's just hard to track. But to see this friendship between Rousseau, the old OSS officer, and Loza, the former plunderer, Loza just dropping by the Met to see him, it raises questions, right? Again, Rousseau knew the whole story, as did other curators. It was still in the media, the Nazi art plundering in the 60s and beyond. And so sometimes they say, we had no idea. They had an idea. Loza became a very impressive figure, if you will. He would stay in fancy hotels and a grand figure. And so, seeing his career in the post-war period documented was really a challenge, but I think I made some progress. We were able to track this picture of the Fischer Passaro, looted from the Fischer family, the publishing family in Frankfurt. They had moved to Vienna, and it was stolen from them after the Anschluss. And I asked Loza about this for 6 years, this picture. Every time I met Loza, his friend and colleague, Peter Griebert, was present. And Griebert himself was an art dealer, a younger generation, but he had known Loza since childhood. Griebert's father had been an art dealer as well. And in 2006, Griebert brought me this document, which indicated that Loza had lied to me when he said he had never touched the Fischer Passaro and knew nothing about it. This document showed that he had sold it for $10,000 and received a commission of $1,500. It went to this Swiss attorney, Friedrich Schöni, and Griebert, who had ties to Swiss art dealers. Griebert's father had been an artistic advisor to Emil Börle in Switzerland, the arms manufacturer who's so controversial. A lot of discussions right now about the Börle collection in the Kunsthaus Zurich. And so Griebert said he had Swiss connections and he would be able to find out what happened to the picture. He claimed that Friedrich Schöni had children, which he did not, it turned out. And there was a foundation of the heirs, which there was not. But I was allowed to inspect the picture. We went to the Zurich Cantonal Bank to look at the picture in a conference room. This is us examining the picture in 2006. It was a long story. It's chapter 8 of the book, great detail, but eventually I went to Liechtenstein and met representatives of this foundation that had belonged to Friedrich Schöni, and they all led me to believe it was Schöni and his children's. It turned out it wasn't Schöni and his children's, it was Bruno Loza's, and Schöni was covering for Bruno Loza. But when Loza died, the mystery was, or some of the mystery was resolved, if you will. The Zurich Cantonal Bank opened with 14 pictures there. There were about 26 other pictures in Loza's home in Munich, some of them looted. One aspect of this whole story that I think is very important is Loza's relationship with the Wildenstein family. As many of you know, the Wildensteins were the most important art dealers in the post-1945 period. They're scandalous in many ways. There was the most expensive divorce in history until Jeff Bezos and plastic surgery gone wrong, perhaps. They're very secretive. This is their headquarters in Paris. But one of the things I found was they were importing to the United States industrial quantities of art in the 1950s, and they were doing it through Switzerland. And who was their agent in Switzerland? Dr. Friedrich Schöni. And we see these documents we found, and Schöni was the key Wildenstein lawyer in Switzerland. And Schöni, it turned out, had helped Nazis during the war smuggle assets out of Germany. And then he worked for the Wildensteins, and then he became Loza's partner, right? This is what it was. He managed Loza's money and created a foundation for Loza. And so this is part of the relationship between Loza and the Wildensteins. It's a sensitive subject. I try not to get out over my skis in terms of the evidence, but when you see something like from Alec Wildenstein that he had known Loza for 60 years, it raises questions. Why were the Wildensteins engaging in this former Nazi art plunder? The Wildensteins had been plundered in Paris before Loza arrived there, but Loza helped process the plundered objects from the Wildensteins, right? So this is one of the questions in the book. We do know that Loza sold to museums. These are two pictures in the German Historical Museum, the so-called Kaiserbilder. There is a dispute over whether they're actual doors or workshop of doors, but they're still beautiful pictures. And so he sold them to the German Historical Institute through Peter Griebert. The German Historical Museum thought that Griebert had sold the pictures, not Loza, so we know. So this is Loza's grave in Bogenhausen, a beautiful cemetery devoted to artists and such, and he found his way in there. He took a lot of secrets to the grave, and we're still trying to understand them. As a last slide, I would just point to this beautiful Van Gogh watercolor, which was sold last week at Christie's. You can see the estimate had been 20 to 30 million, but it realized a price there of 35.855. The provenance for this picture from Christie's was very interesting. It had belonged to a Jewish family, the Mayerovskis, who had to sell it to finance their emigration. And it was auctioned by Paul Graupe. And then it was bought by a member of the Rothschild family. And then it was stolen from the Rothschilds by the ERR and transferred to a Schloss in Austria, Schloss Gogh. I know Loza was at Schloss Gogh very often, especially at war's end. And then there is this private collection. We don't know who that is. And then it next appears in 1978 at the Wildensteins. How does something go from the ERR to the Wildensteins? The question has not been answered. But again, it does raise questions, and we continue to research Loza and try to understand his life and his career. Because Christie's had come to terms with both heirs, the Mayerovskis and the Rothschilds, there was no problem selling the picture, and it reached this result. But in looking at the history, the provenance of this picture, I can't help but imagine that Loza had something to do with it. So thank you for your patience, and I'm happy to answer questions. Ron.
Jonathan, thanks so much for that. If you haven't, for those of you who haven't read the book yet, Jonathan just gave a fantastic summary, but you should still read the book, I have to say, because it's there's so much more detail about these kinds of things. Jonathan, I have a bunch of questions. I'm going to use the moderator's privilege, and I'm going to ask one or two, but then I want to go. We already have questions coming in from the audience, and I want to ask you a question as your former student and as a fellow historian about how you do work like this. And I'm curious. You mentioned in the book itself, you made you and Tim Ryback talking about this old Nazi, but how should historians deal with Zeitzeugen, right? When you're interviewing people, especially when they're years after they've done whatever they've done. That's part A of the question. And part two is, how will our understanding of the Holocaust and the Nazi period change now that we've essentially run out of old Nazis to interview?
Great question. Well, the decision to interview Loza as many times as I did was not taken lightly. It had been suggested to me that it was fine to go talk to him once, but I shouldn't go back and see him so regularly. And just for the record, I did call him Bruno. Everyone called him Bruno, but I was per Z with him the whole time. So it was, there was an element of formality. But I realized he was not going to divulge his secrets on the first meeting, and that one had to develop a relationship with him. And so it wasn't an easy thing to do to go see him. On the days I would interview him, I would wake up in the morning, with an adrenaline rush. And it was actually rather terrifying to go into his apartment and see him. He was massive. He was about 6'4". When I met him, he was age 88 and he weighed over 300 pounds. When he got sick at the end of his life, they actually had to take him out of his apartment on a fire truck, a hook and ladder truck, because he was so heavy. And he had the biggest hands you'd ever seen, and you'd shake hands. And it was disturbing to see, you felt like you were in the presence of darkness, of evil, perhaps, in this way. So, but I thought it was important to do. And for what it's worth, I did send reports on my findings out to the FBI and to Interpol, and I sent information to auction houses and people in the field. I saw myself on a fact-finding mission, and I thought it was important to go and talk to him. It took persistence, right? It took me 5-6 years of asking them about the Fisher Passaro before we finally got movement on that. But in order to do the research for this book, it was also important to have the archival record. And since I wrote Faustian Bargain in 2000, a lot of records have opened up. That might surprise people. Bill Clinton in 1996 had issued the Nazi-era War Criminal Disclosure Act to declassify all the U.S. records involving the Nazis. That took a while to happen, and so we got those records subsequently. The French opened up the archives for the military tribunals only in 2018. In LeBlanc, and so we had access to those archives. The Swiss Federal Archives are amazing. Scholars had not been going there, and exploiting those researchers sufficiently. And I made 4 trips to Bern, Switzerland to work there. So there was more archival material available now than ever before. And again, even the Metropolitan Museum of Art, I give them credit for opening up the Rousseau Nachlass, the Rousseau papers there. Those were not open earlier too. So we have seen movement. And also I should mention the internet is so important for doing provenance research and tracking Nazi looted art. There are databases and the digitization of documents. And so we're in a kind of renaissance in terms of being able to write this history. But I should say too that the paper trail thins out. It doesn't quite go dry, but it thins out for the post-1950 period, right? We have great documentation for the wartime and what Loza did, and even though his thefts are clandestine and there's much we don't know, we have a lot of materials for the war. But it's a post-war period that's really challenging, and that's why I did the oral histories too. That's why for the post-war period you really have to talk to, or it was important to talk to the people. Going forward, yes, we won't have that opportunity. The best we can hope for, I think, is that their papers are passed on to children and grandchildren, and somehow they find the light of day and they come to scholars too. But I definitely had the feeling in the 1990s I should talk to these people now because they're not going to be around forever.
Right. Well, and this leads to a question actually from John Haig from out in the from among the audience. As the paper trail thins out, he notes that some governments are recalcitrant in releasing plundered art or recognizing art as plundered and restituting it. I imagine the paper trail plays a role in here, but what are the reasons why governments, institutions, large museums have been so reluctant to, or let's say have been so reluctant to admit some of the levels of plunder and to return objects of art? I mean, I suppose the obvious example is because these things are worth a lot of money, but there are other reasons too. So please.
Yeah, the restitution field is so interesting, and it is difficult to recover a Nazi looted art painting. We have cases where, like, I've worked for 18 years on a case involving a Cassier Passaro painting. Passaro, by the way, was a French Jewish impressionist, and he was often collected by European Jews, and many Passaros were looted. And the picture is in the Thyssen-Bornemisza Museum in Madrid, taken from the Cassier family in 1939. And both sides, both the museum and the Cassiers, say the picture is looted, but Madrid won't give it back, because they don't have to. In Europe, because the law says there's such a thing as a good faith purchase, or good faith purchasing gives good title, it's very difficult, almost impossible to win civil litigation there, because the possessor of the looted artwork will say, I bought it in good faith. I didn't realize it was looted. So to have any real chance of recovering art by a litigation, you have to work in American courts. And so that's been very challenging for European state institutions. They're state institutions, so they belong to the sovereign, and there's a federal sovereign immunity act, and you have to get around that and get standing in a U.S. court. That's what Randy Schönberg did with the Klimt paintings in Austria v. Altmann. He got standing. So the only place to really pursue works via litigation is the U.S., and one worries that the courts are going to narrow the opportunities there. Now, on the positive side, Europeans have national commissions. The Germans have a German Advisory Commission, and the Austrians have a Beirat, and the Dutch have a commission. And in recent years, those commissions have been, I would say, impressive. They've been making decisions that I think I agree with. They've recognized that forced sales and duress sales involve an unwilling loss of property and are grounds for restitution. So we've seen that it used to be that in order to recover or be compensated for an artwork, one had to show that it entered into the hands of a Nazi plundering institution, like the ERR or the Gestapo or one of the myriad other agencies. But now there's this notion, is firmly established in restitution law, that duress sales should be restituted. And so the European commissions have been better about returning works, even as the US courts have been narrowing the jurisdictional opportunities. So it's a mixed bag. But yeah, you're right. Museums don't want to lose these works. They're so valuable. 36 million for a Van Gogh watercolor. The Klimt paintings in 2006, the Altman Klimt sold for $329 million. And that was an eye opener to museums when they realized how valuable these things were. So, I think that.
Because I think about that, and I think about how much heavy lifting the phrase "private collection" does of that provenance on the Van Gogh, right? That essentially holds the Wildensteins harmless, because they can say they bought it in good faith from this private collector, and Christie's is buying it from the Wildensteins, right? Not buying it from anybody disreputable.
Right. So the Wildensteins had sold it to a Texas collector, Mr. Cox, who died at age 99. And so what Christie's is very good at, and Sotheby's too, is they are settlements, right? They come to terms with the consignors, in this case, the heirs of Mr. Cox in Texas, and with the claimants. And they do more of this than people realize. My friend at Christie's, who worked at Christie's for many years, for 16 years, Monica Dugo, she, in her public lectures, she would say that she resolved about 250 cases in her 16 years at Christie's there, right? So there's a lot more settlements that are quiet and behind the scenes. So we should realize that there are quite a few looted artworks. And again, that's the ideal situation in many cases, is to have a mediated settlement. As you might imagine, litigation is very expensive. And if it goes into protracted litigation, the real beneficiaries are usually the attorneys there. So I think to the extent we can find alternative dispute resolution and avoid litigation, that's really positive.
Thinking about this in our conversation just now, Jonathan, this is a little bit outside of your specialty, but I'm going to ask this. When I hear about the question, when I hear phrases like museums and plundered artwork and don't want to give them back, I don't just think about Holocaust art. I think about the Rosetta Stone, the Pergamon Museum, the Benin bronzes, the Elgin marbles. And I'm curious, is there any cross-pollination between those who are talking about restituting modern art related to a specific event like the Holocaust period and the larger questions of returning art to the places where it came from if it was taken away by force majeure?
Yes, I think the debates and disputes over antiquities and other cultural patrimony are very much informed by what's going on with Nazi looted art and restitution. Now, the challenge for so many source countries, as they call them, the governments in Greece and Italy and Turkey and Egypt, and that is that so many of the cultural objects were taken in the 19th century during the period of the new imperialism, and that was before the Hague Agreement of 1907. Hague 1907 says one cannot take another nation's cultural patrimony during wartime, right? And so that's the first real international law dealing with the removal of cultural property. So the British will always say with the Elgin marbles or the Benin bronzes, sorry, there's no basis in international law. But what we're seeing is that there's a greater appreciation of the ethical obligations and how these the colonial objects are tied to a very troubling history, and it's striking how the ethical issues are coming to the fore. And Merkel had been very, very progressive in terms of colonial objects and restitution. Macron as well. The British are thinking about it as well. So we are seeing some movement there, and I think. It parallels the people's, realization that there's an ethical element in Nazi looted art, that to possess Nazi looted art is really an unethical act, I think, I would say. And so, for example, with the Cassier Passaro that's in Madrid and the Thyssen-Bornemisza, when the decision came down, about a year and a half ago. The case, by the way, just was sent up to the Supreme Court, and SCOTUS is going to consider it in January. Because what happened was the judge decided to apply Spanish law in a U.S. court. And as I mentioned earlier, European law, including Spanish law, with the notion of a good faith purchase, precludes restitution, right? You can have the Mona Lisa and you can say, I didn't know it belonged to the Louvre. I bought it in good faith. And according to Spanish law or Swiss law, you have good title to it, basically. And so it was interesting in the LA Times, they said, well, maybe legally, according to Spanish law, it has to go back. But let's think about the ethics here, about ethics. And the rhetoric, the discourse was very, very similar to that about the colonial object. So I think because there's an ethical element there too, I think we'll see more creative resolutions with colonial objects, just as with Nazi looted art. And just as the Getty, when they had a problem with illegally exported antiquities, they worked out deals with the Italian government, the Greek government, for long-term loans and exchanges, and that it was very, very clever and win-win for both sides. I think, I'm optimistic that we'll be able to do that with both illegally exported antiquities or even legally exported antiquities and Nazi looted art.
Interesting. So to get some more questions from the audience, I see. So Alan Post asked the question, of all the works reported by victim families as having been stolen, what percentage has been restituted, and what percentage might still be possible to be restituted? Do we have any sense of the sort of the umfang of this particular problem?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, a great deal of Nazi looted art was restituted. The vast majority was restituted, I think one can say, certainly in Western Europe. That is fair to say. Eastern Europe is its own can of worms, has its own challenges. The Nazis in Eastern Europe stole everything they could, including folk art and art that is not really museum quality in the West. And it's very, very difficult to research, let alone recover those works in Eastern Europe. And there are many accounts of people who go back to their homelands in Ukraine and Bukovina and Poland, and they go into the villages and they see in the houses there, they see cultural property belonging to Jews that had been murdered or who were deceased, and it's still there. And so that complex of those issues are really hard to resolve. What do you do with all that property that's still in these houses in these villages? In the West, it's a much better situation. The monuments men were heroic. What's the work they did between 1945 and 1950? They worked incredibly long hours. They processed in the order of 10 million cultural objects going through this at collecting points, and so. Yeah, the majority of the works looted from European Jews, I think, were recovered and returned, but there's still a lot that is missing. When I worked for the Presidential Commission on Holocaust Assets in the U.S., we were asked to come up with an estimate of how many works were looted and what's still missing. And our best estimate was that in the West, about 100,000 objects are still missing. Right? There's still a lot out there. Yeah. But again, it's hard. Numbers are always very, very challenging. The Russians, they took in the order of 2.5 million cultural objects out of Eastern Germany between 1944 and 1946. They returned about 1.8 to 2 million objects from 1954 to 1958. Putin still has hundreds of thousands of cultural objects that are in the Hermitage and in the Pushkin and in monasteries. There are 10 million books looted by the Russian trophy brigades that are still in Russia today. So the numbers can get up there in that way.
Pretty fast, yeah.
But there's still a lot of looted art out there. Yeah.
Well, and I can't help thinking my first study abroad experience before I was a young leader when I studied in Heidelberg in 1989 is if you go to the Heilige Geistkirche, there's a monument there that mentions that there was a great library there that was, of course, taken by the by TE and by the during in 1622 when the library was sent off to the library was sent off to Rome, to the Vatican. And I don't think the Vatican has returned the Heidelberg Library from 1622. I imagine it's been integrated into their collection. So I guess that's always the issue, how far back you go. But there are several questions that have just come in, and I want to lump two together that relate. And that is, Andreas Schulze-Ising mentions, we've heard a lot about looting, stealing, and selling art today. It would be interesting to know why the Nazis did this in the first place, sort of how this fit in. And I think this is a way for you to talk about your larger body of work on the role that art played as politics in the Third Reich. And also, Matthias Loeber asked the question, do you think these actors, these looters, did they use existing art market structures to manage this looted work, or did they create a new network? Because I think that says something about the art business if it was possible for it to be so instrumentalized by such malign actors. So
yeah,
take
great
that any way you want to.
Yeah. So, I mean, Hitler clearly had a tremendous interest in art. He saw himself as an artist. He had been a painter before World War I, as most of you know, twice rejected from the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna. But again, he always had that sensibility, and it was part of his worldview, his racist worldview. He believed, of course, that Aryans were bearers of culture, Kulturträger, and that it was incumbent upon these racially superior types to profess an interest in art and culture, and Jews were parasitic and their culture was meretricious. And that's, so the interest in art goes, just to the Nazi worldview. But there was also the Führer principle at play. What interest Hitler was going to interest his sub-leaders. And I think we also have to realize that the Nazi regime was a kleptocracy, and they had an opportunity to steal and embezzle and enrich themselves. And both the ideological, the interest in culture, and the avaricious kleptocratic elements came together when it came to the pursuit of art. But it was just expected of a Nazi leader that one would have an art collection. And every Nazi leader had an art collection that today would be worth more than $10 million or euros, right? I mean, to a certain level of Nazi leader, right? But the collections of the top leaders was extraordinary there. And again, Hitler wanted his leaders to be, his sub-leaders to be rewarded for their activities. We can go into that. Read Artist Politics in the Third Reich. Talk about that. But the question about the art market and such is an interesting one, because the Nazi leaders acquired art not just by plunder but also by legal means. There were legal acquisitions as well, and there were many willing dealers before the war and during the war. The art markets was thriving during the war in that way, and dealers were approaching Nazi leaders and offering to sell works. In the post-war period, the Nazi leaders do use the respectable art trade, and that's one of the things that's tricky about my study, is that individuals who are not Nazis, sometimes Jewish dealers, they ended up interacting with old Nazis and doing business with old Nazis. And if you look at the American art dealers who were involved, ended up trafficking in Nazi looted art, it's striking. Blue chip galleries like Knoedler and emigres like the Pearls and Otto Kallir was trafficking in looted Sheilas as well. Jewish dealers, respectable art trade, even they got involved in the trade in Nazi looted art. There was kind of an intentional amnesia about Nazi looted art in the 50s and 60s. There was a sense that everything that could be done in terms of restitution had been done. The Americans were no longer interested in restitution work. They had a Cold War to worry about, to prosecute. And just as in the Cold War, we turned to former intelligence officers, the Klaus Barbies and such, to help us against the Soviets, we turned a blind eye to the trafficking of Nazi looted art. And again, like Rousseau at the Met, Tedrousseau at the Met, they knew about Nazi looted art, but they chose, it was better for their collecting activities, better for their business, not to be concerned. But that's one of the tricky things about this topic, is that you see these, again, respectable art galleries in America and Western Europe, and Loza and his cohort, they have contact with them. Yeah.
Well, and this is, Sebastian Fries asked this question, and I think this relates, you started to answer it when you talk about the sort of selective amnesia or this intentional amnesia. I think people who read the book will see, right? Loza never talked to you about anything he didn't want to talk about. And I'd say maybe that's true of every old Nazi you spoke to. But did you ever get the sense that Loza or any of the other folks really grappled seriously with the moral aspect of the choices they made?
That's a great question. It's a great question. Loza did not deny the Holocaust. He was not a Holocaust denier. He said it was a mistake of Hitler and the Nazis to murder Jews, that it wasn't necessary for National Socialism. He subscribed to some of the myths that emerged after Nuremberg and the post-war period that the Holocaust was perpetrated by a small group of SS men, not his people in the SS, but other SS men in the East and such. And so it was very complicated the way he said it was a mistake and it's unfortunate, but he also didn't want to think about it extensively. He was incredibly upset. The most angry I've ever seen was when Peter Eisenman's memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe was erected in Berlin there. And he said, this is an insult, was hier eine Beleidigung for the Germans that we have this memorial right there in the heart of our capital there. And so he says, why do you even teach the Holocaust? Why, why do you even bother? It's, it was terrible, but let it pass. And I suggested, I said, what are you suggesting, that we don't learn from this history? We don't study it? And so, he was, again, very complicated. I think he took pride in being a tough Berliner and having a kind of exterior kind of armature there. The way he wanted to present himself. I still remember him when I asked him. I said, "Do you have any regrets about what you did?" And he started to sing the Edith Piaf song, "Je ne regrette rien," I regret nothing. And so, I think that was his facade. Like, I did what I did and let's, move on. But I think deep down there was a realization that this was a heinous crime and he was complicit. So, it's complicated.
It's complicated. And of course, I think you mentioned in the book too, that he may have indeed heard Edith Piaf sing that song live at some point earlier in his career, right?
Yeah.
But the Maria Campbell has a question related to this as well. And that is, does it change when you deal with the second generation? I mean, it's interesting, right? You talk about this whole thing as the fake children of Schönle, but when you dealt with actual children, grandchildren of these Nazi, the plunderers and their roles, how different is their perspective on what their parents and grandparents did and their sort of place in this great chain of being?
Yeah. Gosh, I haven't dealt with the children and the next generation. It hasn't been part of my research. Now, Bruno Loza did not have children. His wife was unable to give birth. And so he has only nieces and nephews. Mm-hmm. And I have had a little bit of interaction with them by correspondence. But one of the, I was told by Peter Griebert that the nieces and nephews of Loza didn't want to engage this history, and that any documents that they had from their uncle that they had destroyed. He said the first thing they did was went out and bought a shredder and destroyed evidence there. I don't know if that report is true or not, but that's what I was told. And I was very glad that Loza gave me part of his papers, right? I know I didn't get the entire. Loza had something that Griebert and others called the Geheimkoffer, the secret, suitcase there. And apparently the Geheimkoffer was in the Swiss bank along with the 14 pictures. And it went back to the heirs, and we don't know what happened to the Geheimkoffer. So, so I haven't dealt with them, but they've been presented to me as unhelpful in terms of researching this history. And it is notable that among the heirs who inherited his 40 pictures, none of the other pictures have been restituted. The Fischer Passaro is the only one, the one I was involved with. We know there are others that were looted as well, and but they refused to give them back. So I guess one has to go on a case basis with a second generation. But there's some indication that, some of them are not as cooperative as one would hope for.
So that's obviously puzzles to be unraveled by you or by future historians. Jonathan, we are just about out of time. I wanted to give you a minute. Is there any last thing you wanted to tell us about your work, about what you're doing next, and how this fits into your larger sort of epic story of art and Nazi Germany?
Well, I love doing detective work. I think I'm an archive rat. I love to go to the archives and do research there. I love to discover new things. I've been offered before to write biographies of Hitler, for example, but I don't have anything new to say about Adolf Hitler biography. So what I like to do is go and find new material. My next project deals with the last days of Heinrich Himmler and what goes through the mind of a mass murderer, the architect of genocide, as he faces capture and post-war justice. And so among the things that I'm going to do, I'm doing this with my partner, historian Wendy Lauer. She's a scholar of the Holocaust. And we're going to go and retrace Himmler's route at war's end when he says goodbye to Hitler at the bunker and then goes up to Flensburg for the successor, the Dönitz government, and is on the run. And there's still a lot of mysteries about Himmler and the SS at the very, very end, including their assets. What did they have? Artworks and gold, the Amber Room. There's rumors that ended up with the SS. We'll research that carefully. Technology like jet engines and what have you. And so we're supposed to go to Vienna this afternoon. We're trying to see if we can make it in because they're going into full lockdown. But we had planned to work next week at the Simon Wiesenthal archive, and he had tracked SS men in their post-war period. You can see I'm really interested in these old Nazis in the post-war period and what they did and how they evaded justice and what they did with their assets there. So unfortunately, we can't work in the Wiesenthal archives because of the lockdown in Vienna, the lockdown in Austria, but we're going to continue with our project.
Well, I hope you do. And I hope that when that project comes to fruition, that we'll be able to bring you back so that we can talk about it again. Jonathan, this was a great delight. Thanks so much for this conversation.
Thank you, Ron. Thank you, Steve. And thank you, Robin, as well. So
thanks, everybody. Great. Steve, over to you.
Let me just add a word of thanks to both of you. Jonathan, it sounds like you have yet another great detective story to tell when you're finished with the research that you're about to embark on or that you're in the midst of. And we definitely look forward to hearing that. I can only underscore what Ron said at the outset. If you haven't read the book, Jonathan gave us a great amuse-bouche, a little taste of everything that is in the book. And I'd encourage people to maybe read it over the holiday break. It is a terrific read. But thank you, Jonathan, for the work that you do. And thank you for bringing this to light. Ron, thanks for leading the conversation with Jonathan. It was really a delight to watch you both. And I look forward to being in touch with both of you in the not too distant future.
Thank you, Steve.
Thanks, Steve. Thank you again,
Thanks,
Ron.
everybody. Peace. Thanks, Jonathan. Happy trails. Safe travels.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.